I'm Phoebe Boucher, and I'm managing editor of Raven Chronicles Press. Thank you for joining us for Raven Talk, our new online podcast. We are hosting monthly conversations with writers, artists, and cultural warriors. Today, Anne Spiers is talking to Sharon Hashimoto about her recently published book, More American, which was a winner of the 2021 Off the Grid Poetry Prize. And we'll talk to Sharon about her work, and then there will be a time for audience comments or questions if we have time. First, we would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities who are very much still here, but it does serve as a first step in honoring the land we occupy and live on, and as an act of resistance against the erasure of their histories. I want to thank all the people that have funded us for the last few years, especially the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, For Culture, King County Lodging Tax, Washington State Arts Commission, with the N.E.A. funding that we usually get from them, and all our individual donors and sponsors. I want to introduce Anne and Sharon, and then Anne will take over. Anne Spiers lives on Vashon Island, on the traditional land of the Slava, I know I've mispronounced that, Indigenous people. She was its first poet laureate and stewards its poetry post. Anne's poems appear widely in journals, anthologies, and online. Her 2021 publications were Rain Violet, which is an incredible book if you haven't read it yet, by Empty Bowl, Black Cut from Black Heron, and this year Red Press is publishing Harpoon in its chapbook triple series. I don't know if it's out yet. She was included in Empty Bowl's women's anthology, Keep a Green Bough, Voices from the Heart of Cascadia, the Madrona Project #2. I know that they are planning on doing 7 in this series of Madrona projects. Sharon Hashimoto's first book of poetry, The Crane Wife, was co-winner of the 2003 Nicholas Roerich Prize, and it was published by Storyline Press. It has just been reprinted by Red Hen Press out of Los Angeles. Her work has appeared in American Fiction, The American Scholar, Barrow Street, Louisiana Literature, North American Review, Poetry, Prairie Schooner, Shenando, and many other literary publications. She's the recipient of an N.E.A. Fellowship in Poetry. She recently retired from Highline College after 29 years of teaching. She deserves a rest. And she writes poetry, short stories, and is currently at work on a novel. Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, welcome. We're all gathered here to focus on Sharon Hashimoto's new poetry book, More American, by Off the Grid Press. And I want you to attend to the title, More American. What is more American or less American? Is more better than less? If you're an American, is it a good thing? It depends upon if you're American in Europe. It's not necessarily a good thing, but we want to be more American. And as you move from community to community, country to country, more or less American. So Sharon will circle that, and I hope by the time you leave today, More American will have sort of blossomed or ballooned for you through her poems and her commentary. But to enter the book, I'd like Sharon to tell us about the stunning cover by Alan Lau. Sharon, you want to show us the book?
Okay. This is the cover of More American. And when my publisher and I were thinking about what the book was going to look like, and I was really afraid that I'm going to have kimonos or American flags and all this horrible typical imagery that you get from Asian cultures. So I knew that because the title was an abstraction, that I should go with some sort of abstract art. And so I looked up my friend, Alan Lau, who supported me for a long time. And he's kind of like the artist that I know of. And he's kind of like a Nelson Bentley in the sense that he gathers all these arts and crafts and music, and he himself is a poet. He was working at Uwajimaya in the greengrocer area, and I just thought of Alan and his work when I thought of the cover. And I called him up, and one of the things that he did, and he's such a generous soul, what he did is said, yeah, I could do that for you because I want you to be happy with the cover of your book. Everyone should be happy. And what he did is he took, I think there's about 18 poems of the first section called Japanese American Dictionary. And he made these little pictures because he works in small forms. And what he did is he used sumi ink and rice paper. And I met him at a coffee shop, and it was kind of like cards. And he had just spread them all out and said, okay, you pick. And he's not like linear in terms of like what he draws. It's kind of like he did them really quickly. He looked at them and said, this is what he was thinking of when he drew his little painting. So it came down to this picture. And there was a second one I really liked, and that was based on the poem called Fifth Chinese Brother Swallowing the Sea. So we decided that there was also kind of like more going on in this picture, which is why we chose this one.
So Sharon,
so that's
there's the 4 red lines. Did that attract you?
Yeah. The reason I didn't pick the Swallowing the Sea one is because there were a bunch of little blue bubbles all over the place. And as much as I liked it and the idea that they were floating and everything was kind of like going around and being connected in circles and stuff like that, it was all blue, but the red lines give you a certain amount of tension. Okay. And this is, later on I'll be reading that poem, but I think there's more tension in the poem, and I think it's also reflected in the cover.
Okay. And Sharon's not going to read is it the 5 Chinese Brothers? It's a children's book. And she assumes the voice of one of the Chinese brothers. So when you get the book, it's just a delight, especially I saw Kate clapping. It's been suggested to be taken out of libraries because of the stereotypical drawing of the Chinese brothers. But I loved it because it showed when he swallows the sea, all the sea creatures are there. And it's a frightening read, and your kids should not miss it. Okay. But so Sharon, you said that you would read a poem for us, and Oriental Flavors. It's the first poem in the book. It's on page 5, and it's a great introduction to the book. Sharon.
Okay, so this is the cookbook that it's based on, right? And so my mother and grandmother used to gather their recipes, and the church would publish these little things. And if you notice the binding, it's all been sewn together with yarn and stuff like that. But this is what I'm talking about in the poem. So this is Oriental Flavors. Cookbook published by St. Peter's Sunday School, September 1952, 5th printing, 1610 King Street, Seattle 44, Washington. My grandma didn't have a measuring spoon or cup. Dinner began with headless birds that sprinted till they dropped. Pulling pinion feathers, she broke the bodies open, gizzards steaming with their own warmth. Each recipe a mimeograph blurred with mom's blue notations. Worked into shoyu-soaked ropes, chicken sizzled in garlic and fat. Home was smell, seaweed, ginger, and rice wine vinegar. I grind sesame seeds, pesto in grandma's suribachi. Noodles soften in the roiling pot. The book begins to fall apart in my fingers. I search for the way grandma stuffed rice into wrinkled skins of age.
Years ago, Sharon once said, we know, I don't know if she was objecting, but it was a great point to make. We know each other's cultures first through food. And I think that a lot of us who were blessed to have grandmothers also learn about our our culture and who we are and family through our grandmothers and their food. So Karen, tell us about your background and your education.
And on the sidelines, you can kind of see here that I'm third generation, which means that my grandparents were the first ones in this country, and they were the ones that probably remember Japan or their version of Japan the most strongly, and they kind of have homesickness about it. Then you have the second generation, which is when World War II happened, they were probably the most impacted by the relocation. And then there's me, the third generation. And it keeps on going into thirds like the fourth, the fifth, and now they're pretty much calling it of Japanese descent. My background is the fact that I kind of come from two different cultures in the Japanese world. My father came from Hawaii, Hawaii, Honolulu. He was born there. And he was working on plantations, sugar plantations and stuff like that. And it's a different culture because people are more lax. They're not very rich. They usually have fairly poor backgrounds, and they speak pidgin. And I used to hear my dad's pidgin, which kind of like totally threw me off in my English pronunciation classes because I kept hearing these strange dissonances. My mother came from Yakima Valley. So her parents settled in around Yakima, Pasco, that area. And they had various different kinds of jobs and things like that. But they're a little bit more cultured. They had a little bit more education. And because they came from that area and on the West Coast, they were the ones that were more impacted by the World War II and the relocation. It was my mother's family that ended up in Heart Mountain. So it would be her mother and father, it would be her immediate family. And a lot of times when I draw upon that experience to kind of like flesh out my own understanding.
So you were going to read a poem using that language.
Yeah. So my, before he died, it was kind of hard to get stories from my family, but this was one that my dad actually told me. And I've written the poem in Pidgin, and it's called Letter to My Father from His Friend Overseas, August 1944. Dear Isami, hey brother, it been long time since you, me, and crazy guy Clyde walked out of old McKinley High. Remember playing pool, stick in hand, elbow in air, ball in side pocket. On wall, how we see Uncle Sam. Eyebrows all bushy white, pointing finger, I want you. Good thing Clyde bad eyes make him 4F. Good thing your mother say no, you too young. Recruiter give me stink eye because I Japanese, but I am member 100th Battalion, 1 Puka Puka. First we think uniform with arm patch, stripe make us look good. Here's secret, Japanese small. So small we wear girl clothes, blouses cut down. Sometime we get special requisition. Combat boot too big. Kilo guy wear size 2.5 EEE. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, meet all kind of people. Mainland boys call me Buddha head, but I know pig. We Hawaiians call them katonk. You know, coconut sound hitting ground. Sure they get confused. I say, you go, stay go. I go, stay come. He shake head, point finger that circle round and round. Other explain, you go ahead and go, and I'll come later on. Bye, we all get along. And then we go Italy, but boat take long time. Zigzag around submarines. Berth 5 deep, me on top. Everybody sick. No make fun. First time fighting, I get chicken skin. German tank fire. Man next to me go down. Arms, legs, all twisted like. Blood all over throat. Pow. Gone. So fast. Okay then, I say to self, but lots more. Isami, this hard to say. Maybe you think, What's the matter you? Every day we watch high place in broken building. We go face down in mud. Lucky one carried out on stretcher. Try pretend. Try not ask. Today, day I die. Stay home, Isami. This for real. Your family needs you. No come, stay, long as you can. Your pal, Tack.
Was there, what thought process, or was there a conflict or an easiness about using the pidgin? And I'm thinking about your mom and your dad's household having sort of two cultures, which is Hawaiian Japanese American and Northwest Japanese American.
So for me, it was just like dad talked this way, mom talked this way. And I was just kind of like watching the ping pong and going back and forth because we all understood what was pretty much going on. It's just that I'm thinking of there's a TV series I've been watching lately called The Expanse. And it's kind of like when you get the characters into the Belto language, it really starts to take on a weight in the character. So I had to do a transition in that poem as far as like, once I found the words that I wanted to use, then also I started kind of like invoking my dad's personality, and the poem kind of came together. And plus the fact that, this is probably the last year that he was alive. And so, it was one of those situations where everything kind of comes together.
So to go back directly to the book, and I was reading it, it's in four separate sections. And why don't you sort of go through those sections to help us define both the book, but also where you came from, your kind or your poetry.
Okay. When I was putting together, it took a long time. I mean, I had all these poems and I didn't know how they were going to come together. And I guess I kind of went back and looked at the fact about how did these poems come to me? So the book is divided into 4 sections. And the first section is called Japanese American Dictionary. For me, a Japanese, American, I do not speak Japanese. I mean, I probably am lucky if I have like 500 words, and almost all of those have to do with food. And because I don't speak it, and because language is always changing, I have to collect my own words. So the words that I remember are kind of like baby words. And so in Japanese American, I talk about like the Oriental flavors, which has to do with food. I also start picking up really strong memories. For example, The First Chinese Brother. I mean, that was an actual book that I could pick up and look at and respond to. I have in here other memories, like I used to go with my grandmother to the Kokusai Theater when it was still there. And that would be all Japanese movies, and they'd have English subtitles. And of course, as you're watching their movie, and even though you didn't know the language, you're kind of going, that's not what he said. She's not saying my darling. And so I was picking up on little things like that. There's certain words, there's like snapshots, stuff like that. So those are the things that go into the first section, which is kind of like me pulling together what I remember and kind of creating my own language, you might want to say.
Wow.
So that would be the first section that we had here. The second section is called The War. And that's when I did a lot of research. And thank God for a organization called Densho. They have all these original source materials that you can go and look at. And also I just picked up a whole bunch of books and started reading about the sociological effects of the war. And so I have things in here like the questionnaire that, loyalty questionnaire that the Japanese Americans had to fill out. I went to Minidoka at one point and got my impressions of what it was like to be in a barrack. And I just, I went to a couple of museums, and I also pulled together some thoughts I had when I think the youngest in my mother's family would be her youngest sister. So what was that like when she took the train to Heart Mountain? The third section is called No Wrong Turnings, and things get more complicated here. And it's kind of like the idea that if you ask somebody, there's not really a straightforward answer. It's kind of like situational, and where things kind of like pull in one direction but push in another. So those are a number of situational things I had there. And the last section I have is called Those Left to Tell. And one of the things I was thinking about is after my dad died, and as we start to talk about food, that the only people who are left to actually know how to make those foods anymore, I mean, it comes down to the fact that in my family, at least, a lot of us have married out. So nobody really likes to eat sushi, or all the work that goes into makizushi is too much trouble when you make it, and it's expensive and nobody's eating it all up. And so those, the younger kids aren't picking it up and passing it down. And I've lost my last aunt. And at the funeral I think it was this last summer, I was looking around and I was realizing the fact that the next generation that's aging is my generation. And we're the ones that are left to tell our stories. If we have any idea about who the grandparents or the second generation are, it's up to us.
Can you look forward to the fourth and the fifth generation?
That's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I could talk about my family, but I would say that one of the things about the internment is that generation, everybody met, you're in all of these little camps, and everybody was Japanese. And instead of like having everybody assimilate, everybody was marrying another Japanese person, because that's where they first met each other, was in the camps. But now we've all kind of like spread all over the place. And, my husband's, German Irish. My sister, I think he's Polish of some sort. And then the kids, of course, this is one thing that Dad was kind of saying is like, so sad. And I was asking him why. He says, all that Japanese, now only tiny bit left.
Wow. Yes. So why
I'm
don't
not
you?
sure that answers it, but kind of.
Oh, you answered it. I mean, yeah, I can see the image, because for so long I would have interpreted that as, oh, he's so prejudiced, or what's the deal, old guy? But I think I've grown, and maybe the culture has gotten to the point where it recognizes not the more American because you're just all American, you're more American because you're many cultures. I know that sounds like a cliche, but when you told me that story, it's like, oh, I get it so differently now, because I think our culture and our own individual age is maybe moving towards some type of acceptance or wisdom. So why don't you read, since you brought up camp, read Day of Departure. It's on page 32.
Okay. So this is Day of Departure, May 9th, 1942. 12 years old, she struggles with balance, one arm dragging the folding chair whose rusted seat flaps open, the other hand grabbing a suitcase. It's humid, so hot. Beneath her winter coat, her best blue striped dress, the one with puffy sleeves, itches. On this last day in Yakima, heat grows from the ground into the pleats. The blinds for windows are latched down. When she boards the train, she trips on bags and bodies. In the midnight dark, a group of young voices sings, "Don't fence me in," until they tire. When she rises from the folding chair, a bump in the track jolts her footing. For miles now, a stranger's leg has pressed into hers. From his sweating suit, a man's stink spreads.
I know that Sharon is a poet and a writer. that doesn't believe so much in poetic license, especially when it comes to facts that she puts into her fiction or into her poetry. You did touch a little bit on the research that you have done for the poems, but is there anything you want to add about the research or where you look or what's come to you from the family, either in stories or in actual things?
I think I mentioned this story once before, but memory is always very elusive. And, I could say something and my siblings would get really mad at me because they say that's not the way it happened. And so, it's difficult. So always in my pursuit of writing is I'm fictionalizing all the time. But there was a point where for the Crane Wife book, I had written a poem called Reparations. And I didn't realize it, but because my impressions were so wrong, the poem is completely wrong. And so I found that out, and I was doing some research, and I found a book by Tatsuma Kashima, and I think it was Judgment Without Trial. And there was a point in there about how the third, fourth, fifth generations are getting their history wrong because the memories are unreliable. And he cited a source. And so, of course, I went back to the footnote, and I was the footnote because I had been working with Dr. Kashima as Asian American Studies. But he was citing me because the point of what he was trying to say is that our memories of what people tell about what happened is so wrong. So to be literal, what happened is in the poem is I'm thinking that my mother was about 12 when she went. And then later on, I did the math. There's no way she was that young. She was much older. But my impressions of the time, my interpretation of it was that she was much younger. So I mean, that's one reason why I look at a lot of books. I'm trying to just kind of like locate myself with what I've heard.
Do you have any objects from your grandmother's kitchen or letters? Or I think once you told me that she wrote haiku.
Yeah. So my mom's mother, she belonged to a little group of people who would meet and they'd write haiku at the bottom of Tenkatsu Cafe. And I think they did it about once every 2 weeks, and they'd sit there and they'd write haiku, and then they'd mimeograph it off, and then they'd send it to each other. And eventually what I did is I gathered all those because I didn't know what they said, and everybody was looking at me and said, well, you're the writer. And I actually had them translated. And so I have some of my grandmother's haiku that I've used with, and there's one poem in there that's in her voice where I've kind of collected about 7 of her haiku.
Okay. Well, at the, in the middle 1900s and the beginning, after 1918, haiku writing groups were by Japanese nationals and second generation. There were dozens and dozens of them. And I know that Tacoma had a master haiku writer that these groups would refer to. And I could even remember when I'd be introduced to a Japanese American family and they go, oh, she's a poet. They'd always say my auntie, my auntie wrote haiku and stuff. And Sharon has some very nice haiku. I think it's only 2 pages of wonderful haiku in More American. So I'm imagining the internment camp, and I'm imagining the generation that was there coming back to visit, and then I imagine the generation who were not in camp. What do you think that you saw, or how is that the main way that you learned about camp, or was it family stories, or did no one talk about camp?
Okay, so how I learned about camp was, you're a little kid, you're listening. I was one of those kids who just kind of like stared at everybody and listened. And if I was probably writing it down inside my head and collecting it for when I was going to be a writer and turn them into poems. What I I remember hearing pieces of conversation, and there was kind of like a delineation. There would be kind of like before the war, and then there'd be like during camp, and then it was after the war. And you would hear these as referentials as far as like our life before the war, we did this and this and this and this. After the war, it was harder, and Grandpa was a janitor or something like that. And so, I mean, you pick up little words and things like that. There were a couple of times when there was a few movies out, and then my aunts would get together and they say, did they get it right? Did they get it right? And they say they got the dirt right. They got the wind right. So the storyline, and that wasn't it. And of course, I wasn't part of the conversation because I hadn't been there, but I'd be listening to my mom and her sister, or, you know, my grandma and stuff like that. How I actually knew when the internment camps affected me was my sister had a project, and she was supposed to be doing some research on family history. So we all packed up in the car and we drove over to Grandma's house because she was still alive then. And my sister was asking her questions. And I think my sister innocently asked the question about, can you draw me what the room floor plan was? And so Grandma, I got her pencil and said, well, there was a potbelly stove here. You had a window over here. You had a cot here, a cot here, a cot here, because there were 4 of them, because there were 4 of us in this room. And there's 1 light bulb. I mean, it was basics. I mean, we couldn't believe how little was in the room. Plus, she talks the story about the wind and the dirt and stuff like that. And at one point, she starts crying. And we're kind of like looking like, why are you crying? And my mother looked at her. And this is where I'm not absolutely sure about memory, if this was what's said or if I imposed upon it later, because the timing doesn't work right. But my mom said, why are you crying? You made it seem like it was fun, that this was something. And she says, that's because you were children and you shouldn't have to worry when you were children. So she was kind of like holding it back. But that doesn't make sense because my mother was much older. And I don't understand the business about being really, really young. Wow. So, I mean, that's what I mean as far as, this is what I remember, this is what I hear, but I have to kind of like interpret it and apply it. It's never 100% direct. In fact, most of the times I was trying to interview people, they're all kind of like staring at me. And I think they felt the burden of being 100% right. And they didn't want that. They didn't want to talk about their feelings as far as like, this is something that you can document and say that this is how I felt. And if anything, they just kind of pushed it away. So it's not that they didn't remember. I'm sure they did, but because they hadn't tried to remember for such a long time, I think things got pretty fuzzy.
Okay. Now that you've finished the book,
mm-hmm.
and we have a sort of an understanding and some background about you finding the book, finding the poems, are you proud? Is it an accomplishment? How do you think you did? Say excellent.
Well, that's another hard question to answer because I've never felt like the person that could get up there and push their stuff and say it was really good. I think it's an accomplishment in the sense that I've unearthed a lot of this. Let's talk about it more on a personal level by having analyzed and seen how these things are set into where they're supposed to be. It's kind of like me having all these jigsaw puzzles and putting together a puzzle. I think I did a pretty good job putting together the puzzle and having a pretty good understanding of what was happening in the past. So that I'm pretty proud of.
Good. All right. So we'll go to questions pretty soon. I see some in the chat, but I want to switch over to talking about the craft or the art of making a poem. And since we've been in the same poetry group for 20 years or more, different people in this group bring different insights or gifts to looking at the individual poem and making suggestions for the poet to pick what to change and what to leave. And for you, because you have such a deep background, both in writing fiction and also in poetry, you come with that feel for the narrative within the poem, if it is within the poem. And what do you notice in lyric poems that if it were discussed in the context of that poem would strengthen the poem?
Okay. Okay, so this is just my way of looking at writing. I mean, it could be completely wrong, and what I have to offer is only suggestions. But I see poems as essentially the image. And then, of course, you know, maybe it's kind of like haiku too, in terms of like the juxtaposition of putting these images together to create a leap or a feeling. As opposed to fiction, which what intrigues me about fiction is usually the theme. What point am I trying to get across? And poems don't really have to have a theme, you know, they kind of like slap you over the back of the head and say, like, did you get my message about what I was trying to say or do? And so because of the fiction, though, what I do notice is when I look at poems, I'm probably more concerned about, and I think this is really hard to do, if you're like if you're going to be a poet who's trying to become a fiction writer. For me, the hardest thing was to do was conflict and tension. And so what I think I offer when I have in a poetry group is to say something along the lines of, where's the tension in your poem? It doesn't have to be a narrative, but it should be something like, what's happening with these images that you're giving to me that kind of like picks me up and takes me someplace. Obviously, when you're doing a short story, you're thinking more of like, you know, your 5-scene acts or, you know, what's your point of attack that starts the story, or how do you end it, and things like that. And of course, you can translate that into a narrative poem. But I think because I had such a problem going from being a poet to a fiction writer, that conflict I thought was the hardest thing to do.
Okay. So let's move over to questions. I'm looking on chat, and Anne, the other Anne, says, is this where the story about the blue feather comes from? Sorry, I don't remember the name of the story. Just that it left powerful images. So, and we don't know what it is. So, Anne, are you here? Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I just remember, Sharon, you posted something recently, you know, in the last 2 years. Do you know which poem I'm talking about? Which story I'm talking about?
Yeah, you're talking about the short story called Blue Jay Feather, and it's about an older woman who has a husband who is not doing well, probably had a stroke, and she is so devoted to him and taking care of him, but whatever life they had is gone out of the marriage. And her only way that she can kind of like escape his being with him all the time and taking care of him is her poetry sessions, where this gentleman has started paying attention to her. And that makes her feel good, but it also makes her feel extremely guilty because she feels like, you know, she has a husband, she owes this husband. So if you were asking how much of that is real and how much of that is made up, it's probably 25% real and 75% made up.
I just remember in a conversation we once had, you said, I have to wait for some of this older generation to die before I can tell their stories. So I wondered if this was based in some relative that you had when I read the story. I thought, ooh, I wonder if this is one of the relatives that she was waiting for to tell the story about.
No, what I have pretty much gone to a different route, which is to be that I make up stories based on stuff. And I don't want anybody to get mad at me, but there is something about hearing other people's stories. And so I have my own take on that as far as being creative.
Thank you.
Kathleen, did
Thank
you have a
Thank
question?
you.
Akala? I can't focus.
Yes, I'm just hitting all the buttons here. I think maybe you've been working with the pigeon for about 10 years or longer. And I thought you were going to try to write a novel in pigeon at some point.
No, not to be too way too. I could do a short story. I could do a poem. I'd probably have to go to Hawaii and live there for a while and to absorb all of it. I mean, these are really strong impressions, but I don't feel secure enough in the Hawaiian culture to have a novel. Maybe a novella at one point. I did have like a short story, a longer short story that I kind of gave up with because I discovered that I didn't know the character well enough to know what his secret was.
Got it.
We did publish something by you, Sharon, though, in Raven that was in pigeon.
You did, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
That was, right.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions? This is your chance. Wave or something. Okay. So Sharon, would you like to, unless someone interrupts me, Sharon, would you like to end with a poem?
Yeah.
Sure. Let's end with the cover poem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So this poem is what inspired the cover to the book. Okay. One of the world's oldest twins dies at age 107 in Japan. Kin Narita, 1892 to 2000. Dear sister, whoever thought we'd live this long? Monkey brows furrowed, the remnants of our hair wisping around necks, tickling our ears. First things we lose last, and I am forgetting the names of all those children. Your 11, my 4 girls, the dead husbands whose photographs dangle on the bedroom wall. Such men wouldn't recognize us now. What's left is our first steps toddling through the farm, chickens broody on their nests, pungent straw and manure, the eggshell pulsing warm in fingers and palm. I know the throb in the hollow of your throat beat in rhythm with mine. Someone knelt beside my wheelchair, told me you had the flu, how you skipped breakfast, wanting to sleep through the morning meal. No egg on rice. Nothing was sadder than this. A part of me doesn't know you've died. My breath catches as if I'm a girl, running just out of reach of your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. And
Thanks,
we all,
Anne.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phoebe.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody who came to listen to me.
yes.
That was wonderful.
This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thought
And-
you were going to read something from
something from
Oh,
You
we have 4 minutes, Sharon.
4 minutes.
Oh, yeah, let's do it.
You want?
The 5
first
Chinese, oh,
Chinese
she doesn't have a copy. Do you have your 5 Chinese brothers there? Oh, you have the poem. Read that.
I
yeah.
have the poem.
Okay, and then we will sign off for sure. So hang in here.
Okay, so this is First Chinese Brother Swallowing the Sea. This is after Claire Huchette Bishop. 1. Bowing at the edge, I can feel the grainy sand beneath my palms. I name the waters, lower my chin. I unhinge my jaw to take everything in. The first taste is a sip of foam, everything the village boy doesn't know, his finger poking clam holes to force a high arc squirt. He stands, hands fisted at his sides, as each level is revealed. Barnacles, anemones, bronzed and many-legged starfish. My tongue is a wave in my mouth, rushing and flowing, kelp and jellyfish like the blood I hold the chambers of my heart. When I close lips over the last dregs, my cheeks bulge with fullness, with roiling. I am indigo, azure, aquamarine. 2.
Right.
Sun dims the scales of deep sea fish flopping their tails, gulls, gills puffing in and out. I never thought the world could be this quiet without the ebb and flow of tides. Far from shore, the village boy zigzags towards a cast-off anchor, to a tangled octopus, towards a silking rivulet. Shoes crushing shells, such a small sound. Something rises and curls inside me, wanting out. I raise 5 fingers as if I could draw the boy back. I drum a driftwood branch against a wide log. I flag my shirt into the wind. His small shape wanders further. Perhaps like so many young, he chooses not to see. Sweat breaks out under my chin. I sputter. When the dam of my lips finally parts, the sea spews forth. My voice is lost in the sea's own. The boy's last words as loud, as raucous as a seagull's 2-note cry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
And we hand it back to you, Phoebe, wherever you are. Thank you all. Thank you, Sharon.
oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased, and thank you so much, Sharon and Anne. And thanks everyone for coming. Our next one is going to be on February 5th, and we're going to be talking about Maya Lin's Confluence project, which is a fabulous project. And Bachelor Hersey just had this book Field Notes out, and Susan Noyes Platt is going to be talking to her about it, and we're going to show a lot of slides about the project, so it should be interesting. Anyway, thanks for coming, everyone. Love everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye.